Hi, my name is David Brown. I'm a member of the Hill Cumorah Expedition Team. We are a group of individuals who began in the year 2001 to informally gather and make annual trips to Mexico for the purpose of finding the location where Mormon had buried his records, from which he abridged and made the record that we have today called the Book of Mormon. We have gathered our information around an archaeologist by the name of Neil Steedy. Neil has spent 40 years plus working in Mexico with the Mexican government on many different projects, but also working with the archaeologists in the area and looking for places where these records may be located. We have spent now the last nearly 20 years, and in the process of looking for that record, we have found incredible amounts of information that parallel the Maya and Olmec cultures with the Nephite and Jaredite cultures in the Book of Mormon. We are going to present here our evidences, and we hope that you enjoy the presentations that we make. We know that it has unbelievably expanded our comprehension of God's love and his desire to bring all these things together that he may collect and gather in his final harvest to include all of Israel. This is something that we do not take lightly. And in the process of doing all of this, we hope that it impresses you to the point that you will look further and further this work. There is so much information. We've just barely begun to provide what we believe is the structure of the information that parallels the Book of Mormon with the archaeology in Mesoamerica. But we hope that you will take this information and do further research and fill in all the blanks. There is so much information that needs to be continued and furthered to fill this out. So without any further ado, we're going to continue with the introduction of why is Mesoamerica where the Book of Mormon took place. What is the Book of Mormon? The Book of Mormon is not a single record from the people of this land. It is an abridgment, a collection of historical information from many different authors filtered through the editorial lens of two compiling editors, Mormon and Moroni. The Book of Mormon is not a record of one culture. It is a historical overview of three different cultures from two different time periods. The Jaredites, who arrived in the Americas at about 2200 BC, the Nephites at about 591 BC, and the Mulekites at about 586 BC. Understand that the Mulekites developed separately from the Nephites for the first 300 years that they were in the Americas. It was not until Mosiah ventured out of the city of Nephi that the Nephites then merged with the Mulekites. And this is something to remember, is we don't often make that distinction of how the cultural story develops in the Americas. We tend to think of the Nephites as both of the groups that came out of Jerusalem or out of the Middle East. What we don't always remember is the fact that these two groups developed separately for 300 years. they were developing their own subcultures within the Mesoamerican region. And so when they finally merge, there's a lot to overcome. There's a lot of differences between the two societies, their value systems, and so on. So this merging of the Nephites with the Mulekites was not something that was easily done. And there were a lot of cultural powers that were working against this unification. And also understand that the Book of Mormon is written from the Nephite perspective. The Jaredite perspective, the Lamanite perspective, and the Mulekite perspective will all vary. Who is a hero to the Nephites? Most likely is not a hero to the Lamanites. All of this provides a context for the cultures we expect to find while we look for the ancient culture of the Nephites. Now, here's an illustration of the geographical area known as Mesoamerica. On the north side, it runs from about the San Luis Potosi region of central highland Mexico down through the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. It includes the Yucatan, the Petén of Guatemala, and goes all the way down then to areas of Honduras and El Salvador. We believe this area constitutes the Book of Mormon geography. In searching for the geography of the Book of Mormon, several aspects must be taken into account, and here are several considerations. The Book of Mormon describes a culture that is very highly developed. Mesoamerica has the Maya culture, which was very highly developed. The Book of Mormon describes a very complex administrative structure with kings, high priests, and judges. The Maya culture of Mesoamerica has kings, individuals functioning as sacred leaders, and they had judges. The Book of Mormon describes a culture with a highly developed currency and complex exchange system. The Maya had a complex weight and exchange system established on corn. The Book of Mormon is strangely silent concerning extreme weather conditions. There is no mention of ice, snow, or dealing with inclement weather. The only reference to snow is a simile where the fruit of the tree of life was as white as the driven snow. This does not necessarily mean that extreme weather conditions were not present, but it does lend itself to being in a moderate climate zone as opposed to a more northern location such as most of the United States. The Book of Mormon culture is multifaceted. There are countless wars between two opposing forces, two opposing aspects within a single society. The Maya are presently seen as multiple city-states due to the numberless recorded wars and struggles. Now, let's take into consideration the last two things that we've talked about. We've talked about the wars, and we've talked about the weather conditions, and the fact that Mesoamerica lends itself to being an area where there is not the extremities of weather. Now, combine that concept with the wars. We don't have any mention in all the conflicts that have gone on. There is no mention of wars and battles that had to be offset or postponed because of inclement weather conditions. There's no talk of starvation due to the fact that someone was snowed in, or weather conditions having to do with ice or anything of that nature that were hardships that would have been experienced if they were in the North American United States region, especially the northern portion. If you get into Michigan and Ohio and Missouri, any of the Dakotas, all of that would have had extreme weather conditions where certainly something would have been mentioned in the dialogue of the Book of Mormon. And there is no mention of these things. Now, That lack of mention does not mean it did not exist, but it lends itself to the fact that more than likely Mesoamerica is a better fit for the weather conditions of all of the things that are described, especially battles, in the Book of Mormon. As a matter of fact, the Maya are divided into two basic types, the Highland Maya and the Lowland Maya. We believe that in pre-classic times, the Lowland Maya were the Mulekites. Later, the Lowland Maya became what we know as the Nephites, once Mosiah's people mingled with the Mulekites. This translates as the following. The Mulekites are the Lowland Maya, and the Lamanites are the Southern Highland Maya. The Nephites are the Northern Highland Maya until they merge with the Mulekites and become Lowland Maya also. And what this means is, you'll notice that the Mulekites are located mostly in the Patana, Guatemala, and their kingdom, it looks like, stretches all the way to the foothills of the highlands. In other words, it comes down to the Usumacinta River and the Passion River, the Salinas River, and it wasn't until about 300 BC or somewhere in the 280 BC area that it appears that the Nephites come out of the northern highland area and follow a river, probably the Lancandon, down to the Usumacinta, and eventually they find the Mulekites in that region. The Lamanites, however, are in the very southern highlands, down in the southern part of Guatemala. We believe that they're in the highlands around the Caminalhuyu or Guatemala City area. The Jaredites, you'll notice, are up in what's kind of referred to as the cradle of the Gulf of Mexico lowlands. They're around the Veracruz area. The Book of Mormon describes a large and successful culture named the Jaredites that preceded the Nephites. Prior to the Maya, the Olmec was the high culture of the Mesoamerican region. In the Book of Mormon record, there is very little social interaction between the Jaredite and Nephite cultures. Coriantumr is the only known overlap between the two. Archaeologists know that there is very little interaction between the Olmec and the Maya, although the Maya did reestablish many of the Olmec cities along the Gulf of Mexico. Note that the Maya and the Olmec had very little geographical as well as chronological overlap. So both the time overlap and both the geographical overlap were very small. The Olmec ran from about 2200 BC to 400 BC. Their region of influence went from the northern part of Mesoamerica, around the San Luis Potosi area, down through to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec and a little bit further over onto the Gulf of Mexico side. But note that the Maya ran from 600 BC up to 400 AD. Actually, the Maya culture went way beyond 400 AD, but we're taking the Book of Mormon aspect of it, the record that we have, that we're pulling our geographical and event clues from. They went from the northern influence, seems to be just beyond the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, down through the Yucatan and down to the southern part of Mesoamerican region, which is the Honduras and El Salvador aspect. So if you look at the overlap, you're only looking at about a 200-year overlap of cultures, and the region is really around the Gulf of Mexico and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Later, what we have discovered is that the Olmec were also along the west coast of the highland region and reached into the southern part of Guatemala, but that was trade. That was still Mayan people who only had an overlap of the trade that was going along the Pacific coast. The Book of Mormon describes a culture that writes in different languages. Reformed Egyptian and Hebrew are named. Similar to the Egyptians, the Maya used hieroglyphs. It can also be demonstrated that they had access to Hebrew scripture concepts, and this will come up multiple times as we go through the evidences that we have found, especially particularly in the Highland Maya and the San Bartolo region, which is in the Patan of Guatemala. The Book of Mormon describes a culture that builds temples and has centralized governments working in concert with their sacred leaders. The Maya were clearly temple builders and placed their government in the midst of their sacred centers. One of the strongest arguments against the Maya being the Book of Mormon culture is the issue of dates assigned to the culture. We believe that the Mayan classical period is the golden age in the Book of Mormon. The reason we believe this is that the greatest accomplishments of any culture occurs when the people are unified and have a clear vision of their purpose. Therefore, we believe that the greatest accomplishments of the Maya occurred between 50 and 300 AD at the height of the Golden Age. But the dates assigned to the Maya classical period run from 600 to 900 AD. This is approximately 500 years later than the Book of Mormon Golden Age. Addressing this issue means we must examine all of the available evidence. We will consider two categories of this evidence: Jaredite dates and the Mulekite Nephite dates. Generally speaking, the Jaredite dates fit with the Mesoamerican Olmec culture. Many earlier studies state that the Olmec culture ran from 1800 to 400 BC, but now those dates have changed. It's recently been demonstrated that the Olmec culture ran from 2200 to 400 BC. And that goes back to a find that was made about 10 years ago, where they dated artifacts from an Olmec dig, an early Olmec dig, around 2150 BC. This is exactly the Book of Mormon timeline. It seems that most of the Book of Mormon events occurring in BC dates do coincide with Maya events. It is the AD dates that are consistently off. It is interesting that the time gap coincides with the advent of Christ. We do not believe this is merely coincidence. The point being that a lot of the things that were done before Christ, specifically, we're looking at murals at San Bartolo that are dated to 100 BC. That fits perfectly. San Bartolo murals, we believe, is a converted Lamanite testimony. The converted Lamanites put these murals in place as their testimony of their conversion. Those date properly. It's the dates after Christ that seem to be dating way late, like 500, 600, 700 AD, when it should be in the 100, 200, 300 AD time frame. Something is wrong here. It is at 34 AD that the Book of Mormon records massive destruction just prior to Christ appearing in the Americas. It is interesting to note how all of the recorded disaster events can be explained by one cause: a shift of the tectonic plates resulting in earthquakes and causing a cataclysmic volcanic eruption. The redistribution of mountains and valleys, the release of waters from the deep, both of those are from a huge earthquake event. The atmospheric blocking of the sun could be from an earthquake event. If there is enough of a cataclysmic shift that it is forcing the release of pressures and debris to be thrown up in to the atmosphere. However, the atmospheric blocking the sun, fire falling from the sky, air so thick that they were unable to start a fire, are really all evidences of a cataclysmic explosion from a volcanic eruption. All of this is clearly possible in Mesoamerica because the region sits on top of fault lines from 4 tectonic plates: Pacific, Caribbean, North American, and Cocos. The volcanoes throughout the region testify to its volatility. Now, in this slide, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner is what's called the Ring of Fire. The Pacific Plate is massive, and it is expanding. There's a ridge along the center line of the plate that is constantly pushing outward. It's constantly being recreated from the center, and it's pushing outward, and all of the area you see highlighted in red, identified as the Ring of Fire, that's where there are subduction zones, where the plates are pushing against continental plates, and the friction of all of that causes there to be not only earthquake activity, but volcanic activity, where the magma is released and close to the Earth's crust. These are all areas where it's happening. You can see in the center photo on the left the identification of the different plates, and notice where the Cocos Plate and the Caribbean Plate are interacting with one another. That is a huge volcanic zone along that ridge, in addition to the fact that there is friction, a slide friction between the Caribbean Plate and North American Plate that actually, where those two meet, there's a huge chasm that has now in it the Motagua River that flows through the center of Guatemala and enters into the Bay of Honduras. You'll notice the main photo here shows all of the volcanoes that have been identified throughout the Mexico and Guatemala, El Salvador, all the Pacific Plate region. The only one that is in the Mesoamerican region, the center of the Mesoamerican region, is El Chichon. This is a satellite image of El Chichon, and it is right now a caldera. In 1982, this volcano had a cataclysmic eruption. It dropped several meters of ash all over the Tabasco, Chiapas region. And they had some incredible events that took place there with rains and the floods, incredible electrical storms, in addition to all the ash. That is not near the cataclysmic event that took place in the 1st century AD. El Chichon, we discovered, is a huge place for cataclysmic events. We believe that a radioactive volcano erupted during this destruction event and disrupted the C14 timeline. We must stress that this is speculative theory, but it is also feasible and reasonable. In other words, we're not just pulling information out of thin air. We've talked with volcanologists, and we have discovered that it's very probable that this event took place. If a radioactive volcano erupted during this time, then it would have increased the amount of radioactivity found in organic materials that were exposed to the event. This increase in radioactive isotopes would then skew the C14 data scale. The materials will test younger so that organic materials dates at 600 AD instead of 100 AD. And this is something that has been scientifically studied. There was a study done with materials found at certain eruptions in Mount Etna, there in the Pompeii area. And some of the eruptions, not all of them, had additional radioactive material that changed and skewed the carbon-14 dating. This is exactly what we find in the dating issues concerning Mesoamerica. The pre-classic period is exceptionally long, then suddenly there is an explosion of cultural developments that result in the classical period. Now, this is a timeline that we're showing. The Book of Mormon and its dating aspects are reflected on the top scale. And it shows that the Book of Mormon pre-Golden Age period should have been from 600 BC to about halfway through the first century. From that halfway point through the first century to 400 AD would be the Golden Age. But in the Mayan time scale, the archaeological time scale, notice how long the pre-classic period is. It goes from 600 BC all the way up to, almost halfway through the 6th century. And then you still have that 300-year period that is considered the Mayan classical period. The skewed C14 dates make the pre-classic period appear longer. So if events were taking place in the 50 AD period, but now the testing is skewed because there's an overabundance of radioactive materials, then the half-life aspect is skewed and it appears younger. And that's why we believe that there's this dating issue shift between the two parallels of the Book of Mormon and the Mayan cultures. Mayan event dates after the time of Christ vary 500 to 800 years later than the Book of Mormon events. So if there was an alteration in radioactive material at the beginning of the classical period, it would make the pre-classic period appear longer. Mesoamerican and the possible areas and intensities of radiation levels. The point being here that because of the prevailing winds, those areas from the wind side of the event will have less problems with dating because of the radioactive materials and their distribution. The prevailing winds are blowing those out across the Patan and into the Yucatan. And this isn't, this also is not just speculation. The reason that we know about a 1st century AD explosion of El Chichon is because they have found particles, ash particles, in the Greenland ice caps from that time frame and have been able to trace it back to this event of this cataclysmic explosion of El Chichon. Volcanologists have recorded this. We've got the reports that demonstrate it. Therefore, we do not feel constrained by the AD C14 dates assigned to the Maya events for our studies. The carbon-14 dating mechanism is not an accurate measurement when the radioactive isotopes have been skewed. Rather, We use historical figures and events in our efforts to correlate Book of Mormon stories to archaeological findings. And there are an incredible amount of correlations that seem to validate this theory. And our point being that if we have cultural events, historical figures, regional subcultures, and their movements that match along with artifacts that match, and the only thing that doesn't fit is the timeline, then as an investigator, I have to think there may be something wrong with this timeline aspect. I can't throw out the overabundance of these other evidences just because I can't get that one to fit. I have to throw that out for the moment and see if I can reconcile all of this and find a reason why the timeline doesn't match. And that is our approach to these studies. We approach Book of Mormon archaeological evidence from the aspect of what we call trends or patterns. That is to say, we look for evidences of specific Book of Mormon stories and events. By doing so, we have found the Maya matrix. This is something that Neil Steedy has coined, the Maya matrix. This matrix is founded on the assumption that the major characters in the Book of Mormon are also the major characters found in Mesoamerica. Also, that the major cities mentioned in the Book of Mormon are major cities found in Mesoamerica. If the Book of Mormon is true, then we expect that these Book of Mormon people and events will be found. The Book of Mormon provides us with a list of 4 kings at Zarahemla that end with a transition to judges. Therefore, we believe this is a unique pattern that we should be able to find in Mesoamerica. We do not look for exact name matches, especially when we cannot fully read the Mayan language. The Book of Mormon is a translated document. However, patterns of names should be embedded in the translation, even though names may not match. Understand, we respect the work being done by modern archaeologists and epigraphers. They have uncovered remarkable finds and have developed very reliable concepts that explain some of the anomalies they have encountered. In almost all cases where we draw parallels between Book of Mormon events with Mesoamerican history, we bow to and rely on the work being done by archaeologists. Our only exceptions are based on the insights that the Book of Mormon provides. Therefore, we adhere to the Book of Mormon timeline because too many other parallels align when the assigned dating is ignored. A good investigator understands that if the overwhelming amount of evidence correlates, then something is wrong with the interpretation of the data on the time aspect. In the chapters to come, we will demonstrate the overwhelming evidences as to why Central America, or Mesoamerica, is the region, and the Olmec and Maya are the cultures described in the Book of Mormon. So, that finishes our first chapter on why is Mesoamerica where the Book of Mormon took place. The rest of our chapters that we present, our presentations that we present, will be the presentation of evidences and how to interpret those evidences, not by skewing what has been uncovered, but by looking a different perspective or taking a different perspective and interpreting through a different lens. And in the process of doing so, we are going to find amazing, amazing things. Thank you. Be sure to go ahead and look up chapter 2, because this is where the evidences begin to come together, and it's just amazing. Thank you.